Imagine for a moment that you are sailing through the North Sea on a stormy night. The waves crash violently against your ship. The fog is so dense you can barely see a few meters ahead. And suddenly, emerging from the darkness, like an apparition from your worst nightmares, you spot a black fortress rising from the frozen waters. Its pointed towers pierce the night sky like giant claws, and an aura of despair so intense emanates from the structure that it literally freezes the blood in your veins. You have just found Azkaban, the most fearsome prison that ever existed in the magical world, a place where hope itself goes to die, a slow and agonizing death. But what you don't know, what not even the most educated wizards fully understand, is that this fortress holds secrets far more sinister and disturbing than any prisoner ever incarcerated within its walls. The story I'm going to tell today is not just about a prison. It's about how fear, greed for political power, and the deliberate negligence of an entire society transformed an already cursed place into the greatest symbol of terror in the wizarding world. It's a story that the Ministry of Magic itself tried to bury for centuries, but one that needs to be told. But before we begin this journey through the frozen corridors where the screams of hundreds of lost souls echo, subscribe to the channel. It's free and helps the channel immensely. Turn on the bell too, because you won't want to miss any videos from the magical world of magic. To truly understand Azkaban, we need to go back to the 15th century, a time when the magical world was still immersed in deep and chaotic darkness. There were no laws that adequately regulated the use of magic. There was no Ministry of Magic to maintain order, and powerful wizards could do practically anything without legal or moral consequences. It was an era where only power determined what was possible or acceptable. It was in this time of absolute chaos that one of the most disturbing and enigmatic wizards in history was born, or rather, manifested as a force of nature, Ekrizdis. Not even the oldest and most secret archives of the Ministry of Magic can accurately determine his true nationality, family origin, or even his real name. Some specialists in dark arts history speculate that he was originally from Eastern Europe, perhaps from the Balkans, where dark magical traditions have always flourished with more intensity and less control. Other researchers, particularly those who studied the artifacts left behind in his fortress, believe that he simply emerged from nowhere, as if he were a pure and concentrated manifestation of human malevolence taking physical form. What we know with absolute certainty is that Ekrizdis possessed extraordinary magical power, unprecedented in documented history, accompanied by a mind completely corrupted by sadistic obsessions that defy any attempt at normal psychological understanding. Unlike other famous dark wizards in history, such as Grindelwald or even Voldemort, who sought political power, world domination, or personal immortality, Ekrizdis seemed driven only by primitive and insatiable sadistic pleasure. His only apparent motivation was human suffering in its purest and most concentrated form. Ekrizdis did not choose an existing island to build his fortress of horrors. Magical archaeological evidence suggests that he literally created or drastically expanded a small rocky outcrop lost in the North Sea, using dark magic of such an advanced level that it defies the understanding of the greatest contemporary experts. Imagine the incomprehensible magnitude of this magical feat. He molded the very earth, rock, and marine foundation using not only his personal magical strength, but also vital energy systematically extracted from hundreds, possibly thousands of victims over decades of sadistic activity. The construction of the fortress was not a conventional architectural project, not even by the magical standards of the time. Each stone was placed with specific dark rituals. Each wall was erected while elaborate tortures took place as an integral part of the construction process. Each tower was built using not only traditional magic, but concentrated human suffering as a literal form of mystical mortar. It is for this reason that even centuries after its creation, the very walls of Azkaban seem to exude despair and emanate a negative energy that instantly affects anyone who approaches the structure. But how did Ekrizdis manage to attract victims to an isolated island in the middle of the ocean? He developed and perfected some of the most sophisticated attraction and illusion spells ever recorded in the history of magic. Muggle sailors navigating the region reported seeing mysterious lights dancing over the waters, hearing melodious voices of deceased loved ones calling them by name, or spotting ships apparently in distress that desperately needed help and rescue. Others described visions of safe harbors appearing magically in the midst of violent storms, or paradisiacal islands where they could find shelter and provisions. Once these innocent victims set foot on the rocky coast of Ekrizdis' island, there was absolutely no possibility of escape. The spells he had woven around the fortress not only prevented physical escape, but also magical communication with the outside world. The island existed in a kind of isolated dimensional bubble, where screams could not be heard beyond its shores, and where attempts to send magical messages simply disappeared into the void. The rituals that Ekrizdis practiced on his victims were so abominable and disturbing that even wizards specialized in the dark arts, veteran aurors who had seen the worst possible magical crimes, and researchers from the Department of Mysteries categorically refused to speak about them when they finally investigated the fortress after his death. What we know, through fragments of reports that leaked over the centuries, is that Ekrizdis did not kill his victims quickly, or even in a relatively merciful manner. Prolonged, elaborate, and psychologically devastating suffering was absolutely essential for his macabre experiments. In the deepest and most secret dungeons of the fortress, Ekrizdis maintained what can only be described as an unprecedented laboratory of horrors in the history of the magical world. It was not merely a place of traditional physical torture like medieval Muggle dungeons. It was a highly organized and methodically planned research center where he systematically explored the darkest and most forbidden limits of magic, particularly those related to the manipulation of the human soul, the nature of consciousness, and the fundamental mechanisms of psychological suffering. Evidence left behind suggests that Ekrizdis was obsessively focused on discovering how the human soul could be manipulated, fragmented into pieces, and literally consumed as a source of magical power. His experiments had no known precedent in the documented history of magic, not even in the darkest periods of antiquity. He had discovered ways to keep his victims completely conscious and mentally alert, even during physical and psychological tortures that would normally lead to complete madness, coma, or immediate death. Even more disturbing and sinister was the fact that Ekrizdis was clearly trying to create something specific through his experiments. The investigators who entered the fortress after his mysterious death found entire rooms covered with runes and magical symbols that did not belong to any known or documented magical tradition. There were elaborate altars where extremely complex rituals were performed repeatedly, leaving a residual energy so dark and concentrated that it caused immediate nausea, dizziness, and panic attacks in anyone who simply approached these areas. It is here that the most shocking and disturbing theory about the true activities of Ekrizdis emerges. He not only attracted Dementors to his fortress through the suffering he created. Evidence strongly suggests that he created them, or at least created the perfect and specific conditions for them to physically manifest and multiply in unprecedented numbers. Dementors may not be natural creatures of our world, but rather artificial abominations created through the concentration and manipulation of human despair on an industrial scale. No one knows exactly how or when Ekrizdis died, and this uncertainty adds an extra layer of mystery and terror to his already haunted history. There is no historical record of magical battle, known disease, accident, or assassination. There is no evidence that other wizards discovered his location and confronted him. A prevailing theory among dark arts experts is that he simply literally consumed himself through his own experiments, that his investigations with forces so fundamentally dark and corrupted eventually devoured his own vital essence until nothing remained but pure, concentrated malevolence. The exact moment of his death was marked by extraordinary and terrifying magical phenomena that were observed and documented by sailors hundreds of kilometers away. Reports from the time describe a column of black light. Yes, light that was simultaneously luminous and dark, rising from the North Sea and reaching impossible heights in the atmosphere. This phenomenon was followed by a supernatural silence that lasted exactly 3 days and 3 complete nights, during which not even the sound of ocean waves could be heard in the region. When the powerful concealment spells that Ekrizdis had maintained for decades finally broke with his death, the island suddenly became visible to the magical world for the first time. But what the first official investigators from the Ministry of Magic found, when they finally arrived at the location, traumatized them in ways that affected the rest of their lives. The fortress was not simply empty or abandoned, as would be expected after its creator's death. It was literally infested with Dementors in a concentration and organization never seen before or after in documented history. These were not common Dementors that occasionally appeared in dark places like ancient cemeteries or battlefields. They were visibly more powerful, more organized and more intelligent creatures, as if they had been deliberately cultivated and perfected through generations of concentrated feeding. And even more terrifying, they seemed to be consciously protecting something specific inside the fortress, something that Ekrizdis had left behind and that they considered sacred or essential to their existence. The discovery of Azkaban created the first great ethical and political debate in the history of the British Ministry of Magic. For more than an entire year, witches and wizards from the highest governmental ranks met in almost daily secret sessions to decide the fate of the cursed fortress. The dilemma was genuinely impossible to resolve satisfactorily for all parties involved. On one side of the discussion, there were the Destroyers, led by the then head of the Aura Department, Lysander Scamander, great-grandfather of the famous magizoologist Newt Scamander. Lysander argued passionately and convincingly that Azkaban was an abomination against the very nature of magic, a festering wound in reality that contaminated the entire magical world around it by its mere existence. His arguments were supported by disturbing evidence that had been collected during the first investigations. The fortress continued generating new Dementors in an apparently spontaneous and constant manner. The dark energy emanating from the structure was slowly spreading through the North Sea, affecting marine life and weather patterns. More Muggle sailors were disappearing in the region each passing week, and more sinister still, the fortress seemed to be serving as a kind of dimensional beacon that was attracting other dark entities from parallel realities. On the other side of the debate, the containmentists, led by the mysterious director of the Department of Mysteries, argued that destroying Azkaban could have even worse consequences than allowing its controlled existence. They presented terrifying scenarios based on secret research. The thousands of Dementors that had made the fortress their permanent home could spread uncontrollably throughout the world if their dwelling were destroyed. The destruction of the structure could release primordial magical energies that were apparently being contained or channeled by the fortress's architecture. Azkaban could be studied safely and in a controlled manner to better understand the dark arts and develop more effective defenses against them. And most worryingly, any attempt at magical destruction could fail completely and only make the fortress more dangerous and unpredictable. The debate extended for more than a year, and during this prolonged period of governmental indecision, sinister and inexplicable events began to manifest in an increasingly larger area around Azkaban. Muggle ships passing more than 50 kilometers from the island began to report that their crews were suddenly overtaken by episodes of deep depression and suicidal thoughts without any apparent cause. Marine animals native to the region began to completely avoid the area, creating an ecological dead zone in the North Sea. And most worrying for magical authorities, other dark arts practicing wizards from various parts of Europe began to be mysteriously attracted to the region, as if Azkaban were a supernatural magnet for human malevolence. The final decision was a political compromise that pleased very few and haunted the conscience of all involved. Azkaban would be left completely intact, but would be constantly monitored through a magical patrol system and kept in quarantine through containment spells. Specialized auras were assigned to permanently patrol the waters around the island and ensure that no civilian or curious wizard approached the fortress. This decision, made entirely based on fear of the possible consequences of destruction, was the first fatal step toward the institutionalized tragedy that would follow in subsequent decades. When the International Statute of Secrecy was finally implemented in 1692, it brought peace between wizards and muggles, but also brought completely unexpected administrative problems. The small magical prisons that were scattered across various cities and towns throughout the country became a significant risk of magical exposure. Escape attempts by incarcerated wizards frequently resulted in uncontrolled magical explosions, strange lights visible at great distances, supernatural smells that could not be explained, and other phenomena that could easily attract unwanted attention from Muggle authorities. The previous ministry had begun to develop a sensible and humane solution: a single, secure prison located on one of the remote Hebridean islands, far from Muggle populations, but still accessible for proper administration. The architectural plans were extensive and carefully thought out, including security systems based on trained human guards, psychological rehabilitation measures for prisoners, work programs that would allow criminals to contribute positively to society, and even libraries and educational opportunities for those who demonstrated genuine progress. It was in this delicate political context that Damocles' role managed to build his power base and eventually ascend to the position of Minister for Magic. Roel was not born evil or sadistic by nature. He was deliberately molded by family circumstances and personal choices over several decades. Son of a traditionally powerful pure-blood family that had lost much of its political influence and financial wealth with the implementation of the Statute of Secrecy, Raoul grew up constantly hearing bitter stories about how wizards had been betrayed and humiliated by their own political leaders who chose to bow down to Muggles. Raoul was extraordinarily charismatic, politically astute in ways that bordered on genius, and possessed an intuitive understanding of how to manipulate collective emotions for personal ends. He understood from a very young age that the anger and resentment that had accumulated in the wizarding community over decades could be carefully channeled and directed towards specific political objectives. His rise to power was not accidental or opportunistic. It was meticulously planned and executed over more than 2 decades of patient preparation. Raoul's political strategy was built on 3 fundamental pillars that he developed and refined over the years. First, he publicly positioned himself as the supreme defender of legitimate wizarding rights against what he characterized as disguised oppression. He convincingly argued that the Statute of Secrecy had gone far beyond what was necessary, that wizards were being forced to live like criminals in their own magical world, hiding their natural abilities and denying their inherent superiority. His public speeches were inflammatory and emotionally charged, but technically careful not to directly violate any existing law. Second, Raoul meticulously cultivated personal and political relationships with influential pureblood families throughout the country, promising specific policies that would favor those who had remained true to ancestral magical traditions and resisted Muggle cultural contamination. He was particularly skilled at exploiting and amplifying the fears that many purebloods harbored, that their ancestral magical lineages would be gradually diluted through marriages with Muggleborns and half-bloods. Third, and most sinister, Raoul systematically began gathering compromising information and personal secrets about his political rivals and anyone who might pose a threat to his objectives. He did not hesitate to use sophisticated blackmail, psychological intimidation, or emotional manipulation to get what he wanted. His network of spies and informants extended throughout all ministry departments and many private organizations. When Raoul finally officially ran for the position of Minister for Magic, he had a powerful and well-organized political machine operating in his favor. His campaign promised to restore dignity and pride to the magical world, stop humbly bowing to Muggles and their limitations, and restore the natural order where wizards occupy their rightful place as superiors. For a community still deeply wounded and resentful of the changes imposed by the statute, these messages were emotionally irresistible. Raoul's election was more competitive than his most optimistic supporters expected, but his final victory was decisive enough that he interpreted the result as a clear popular mandate to implement the most radical policies of his platform. His first actions as minister were calculated to quickly consolidate his political power and unequivocally signal the beginning of a new era in magical politics. The action that would forever define his historical legacy and haunt the conscience of the magical world for centuries was his decision about the problem of magical prisons. The carefully developed plans by the previous government for a humane and effective prison were immediately rejected by Raoul as unnecessarily expensive and excessively gentle with criminals who do not deserve such consideration. In a ministerial meeting that became legendary for its calculated coldness and casual cruelty, Raoul declared with a smile that haunted those present, "Why should we spend precious resources building a new prison when we already have the perfect facility waiting to be utilized?" When shocked members of his team tried to explain exactly why Azkaban was completely inadequate to serve as a prison for human beings, citing the Dementors, the dark history, the devastating psychological effects, Raoul responded with what would become his most infamous and morally repugnant phrase, "Excellent, criminals should suffer real consequences for their actions, and what better way to ensure they never repeat their crimes than to traumatize them permanently and unforgettably." The proposal to use Azkaban as an official prison encountered fierce and immediate opposition in the Wizengamot. Recognized experts on Dementors testified extensively about the devastating and irreversible psychological effects of prolonged exposure to these creatures. Experienced healers from St. Mungo's Hospital explained in medical detail that prisoners exposed to Dementors for extended periods frequently developed neurological and psychological damage that was literally impossible to cure, even with the most advanced magic available. But Raoul had prepared his political strategy with typical foresight. He skillfully framed all opposition as excessive and inappropriate sympathy for dangerous criminals and moral weakness in the face of the worrying growth of criminality. He argued in an apparently logical manner that the absolutely terrifying nature of Azkaban would serve as definitive prevention against any form of magical criminality. More cynically, Raoul had calculated that using Azkaban would be extraordinarily cheap for the government. It would not be necessary to hire human guards, build new security facilities, or maintain complex administrative systems. The Dementors would literally do all the containment work for free, continuously feeding on the prisoners' suffering as a form of payment. The first prisoners sent to Azkaban were criminals of various levels of severity, from wizards who had accidentally violated the statute of secrecy to those guilty of more serious magical crimes, such as using unforgivable curses. Rowler had insisted on starting with a representative sample of the prison population to scientifically test the effectiveness of the new prison approach. What happened to these first prisoners was documented in medical and psychological reports that only came to light decades later, when Eldritch Diggory finally gained access to files classified as ultra-secret. The prisoners were transported by special ships equipped with temporary protection spells that partially isolated them from the influence of the Dementors during the journey across the North Sea. But the exact moment they set foot on the rocky coast of the island, all magical protections instantly broke down. The first reaction of all prisoners was invariably identical, a supernatural cold that seemed to penetrate not only the physical body, but the very soul, followed by a devastating wave of despair that was not simply sadness or common fear, but an absolute and inescapable existential conviction that there would never again be joy, hope, meaning, or purpose in life. The Dementors did not just passively feed on the happiness of newly arrived prisoners. Witnesses described how these creatures moved deliberately slowly around new prisoners, as if they were literally tasting and savoring different types of human despair. Some Dementors seemed to prefer the pure terror of young criminals, while others gravitated toward the deeper and more existential despair of older prisoners. Azkaban's cells were not designed with any consideration for comfort, human dignity, or even basic physiological needs. They were cubes of cold and damp stone, without windows or any source of natural light, with only a small hole in the floor for bodily needs. There were no beds, blankets, furniture, or any object that could provide the slightest physical or psychological comfort. The worst aspect of the experience was not the deplorable physical conditions, but the absolute mental and emotional isolation that the Dementors imposed. These creatures fed not only on happiness and hope, but specifically on positive memories. Prisoners gradually lost access to any memory that could bring consolation, strength, or identity. They literally forgot the faces of loved ones, moments of family joy, personal achievements, and even small, simple pleasures like the taste of favorite food or the feeling of the sun's warmth. The process of mental deterioration in Azkaban followed a predictable and scientifically documented pattern that became known among the few healers who studied the phenomenon. During the first weeks, prisoners experienced intense despair but still maintained their fundamental consciousness and identity intact. They still clearly remembered who they were, why they were imprisoned, and maintained hope of eventual release. Many spent this initial period constantly screaming, begging for mercy, or desperately trying to negotiate with the Dementor guards, who naturally never responded or reacted in any way. After the first month of incarceration, prisoners began to lose their first significant positive memories. They gradually forgot specific moments of happiness, but still maintained factual memories about their lives and important relationships. During the first 3 months, significant and visible deterioration of fundamental personality occurred. Prisoners became progressively apathetic, stopped communicating completely with other prisoners or guards, and lost any interest in food, personal hygiene, or basic survival activities. After 6 months of continuous exposure to Dementors, most prisoners had lost their fundamental personal identity. Many forgot their own names, could not recognize family visitors, and lived in a state of constant mental confusion that doctors described as magically induced dementia. Prisoners who survived a full year in Azkaban suffered virtually complete mental collapse. They developed catatonic behaviors, or alternatively, episodes of completely purposeless or directionless aggression. Many stopped eating voluntarily, not by conscious choice, but because they simply forgot they needed food to survive. After 2 years of incarceration, the vast majority of prisoners who still survived physically were mentally dead in all significant senses. They were empty bodies that continued breathing and performing basic bodily functions, but without any spark of humanity, personality, or remaining consciousness. The most terrifying and morally repugnant aspect of this process was that it was completely irreversible, even with the most advanced magical treatments available. Prisoners who were eventually released, transferred to other facilities, or pardoned never fully recovered from their experience in Azkaban. They lived the rest of their lives as psychological shadows of themselves, permanently unable to experience genuine joy, form meaningful emotional connections, or find any sense of purpose in existence. When Raoul finally left the position of Minister for Magic, in circumstances that were never completely clarified and remain mysterious to this day, many in the magical community hoped that his successor, Perseus Parkinson, would implement urgent and humanitarian reforms in Azkaban. After all, the first reports about the truly horrible conditions in the prison were already circulating discreetly among government officials, and there was growing pressure from emerging wizarding human rights groups and magical charity organizations. Unfortunately, Parkinson proved to be equally cold, calculating, and morally insensitive as his predecessor. His justification for keeping Azkaban operating exactly as it was more pragmatic and apparently rational, but equally cruel in its implications. The prison works perfectly for its stated objectives. We have not had a single escape in decades of operation. Magical crime rates are at historically low levels throughout the country. Why should we modify or abandon a system that clearly demonstrates unequivocal success? During Parkinson's term, Azkaban not only continued operating, but actually expanded significantly. New wings were magically added to Ekrizdis's original fortress, and the number of resident Dementors continued growing in an apparently spontaneous manner. More sinister still, Parkinson established an official zero-tolerance policy for magical criminality, which resulted in Azkaban sentences being imposed for crimes that previously would have resulted in fines, house arrest, community service, or other more proportional and humane forms of punishment. The arrival of Eldritch Diggory to the position of Minister for Magic marked the first genuinely serious attempt to confront the moral reality of Azkaban and question the continuation of its operation. Unlike his predecessors, who had been content to receive written reports about conditions in the prison, Diggory did something no minister had done before. He insisted on personally visiting the fortress before making any decision about its future. Diggory's visit to Azkaban became absolutely legendary among ministry officials, not only for his personal courage, but for the psychological consequences it had on him. He spent 3 full days in the fortress, accompanied only by 2 auras of his absolute personal trust, and insisted on seeing all areas of the prison, including the cells of long-term prisoners and the cemetery that had been established on the island. What Diggory saw during those 3 days traumatized him deeply and forever changed not only his perspective on justice and punishment, but his fundamental understanding of human nature and the moral limits of governmental power. In the extensive reports he wrote immediately after the visit, reports that were kept secret for decades, he described scenes that could have come from the darkest nightmares of human imagination. In his own words, preserved in the ministry's secret archives, I found prisoners who had completely forgotten who they were, where they came from, or why they were there. They looked through me as if I were completely transparent, as if I did not physically exist. When I tried to speak with a man who had been incarcerated for using defensive magic against Muggle attackers who were trying to kill his family, he did not respond in any way. When I asked the auror accompanying me how long the man had been in Azkaban, the answer was 6 months. 6 months to completely and irreversibly destroy a healthy human mind. Diggory continued. In the prison's central courtyard, there is a cemetery that extends far beyond what any external person could imagine. It is not a small or discreet cemetery, but a considerable expanse of land covered with hundreds and hundreds of simple stone tombstones. When I asked the staff how many prisoners had died since Azkaban began operating as a prison, no one could give me an exact number. "We stopped keeping detailed records after the first 1,000 deaths," was the casual response I received from a veteran administrator. Even more devastating was his observation. The worst aspect is not the prisoners who died and found peace in death. The worst are those who remain alive, but desperately wish to be dead. I witnessed prisoners begging directly to the Dementors to finish their suffering, to perform the Dementors' kiss and end their torturous existence. And the Dementors, as if they perfectly understood the plea and savoured it, always deliberately refused. They clearly prefer slow, constant and prolonged suffering to a quick and merciful end. Diggory returned to London completely transformed and determined to close Azkaban immediately, regardless of any political or financial consideration. He established a special committee of experts to explore viable alternatives and immediately began working on comprehensive legislation that would permanently prohibit the use of Dementors as guards of any prison facility. Tragically, before Diggory could implement his revolutionary reforms, he contracted dragonpox and died in circumstances that were always considered highly suspicious. Dragonpox was an extremely rare disease that generally only affected those who worked directly with dragons on breeding farms or conservation sanctuaries. Diggory had never had any professional or personal contact with dragons. The coincidental timing of his death, occurring exactly when he was about to dismantle Azkaban, raised questions that were never adequately investigated. With Diggory's sudden and convenient death, all planned reforms for Azkaban were immediately abandoned, and the prison continued operating exactly as before for more than 2 additional centuries. For almost 300 consecutive years, Azkaban maintained a record that the Ministry of Magic consistently used as the supreme justification for its existence and continued operation. 0 documented escapes. Literally 0. Not a single person had managed to escape from the Dementors' fortress in 3 centuries of functioning as an official prison. This apparently perfect record was not just an impressive statistic for use in governmental propaganda, it was the fundamental basis of all British magical security policy. Entire generations of ministry officials were educated and trained, believing that Azkaban was literally impossible to escape from, that it represented the absolute maximum in prison security. The prison became a powerful symbol of absolute and incontestable governmental authority, but this apparently perfect record hid a sinister and morally repugnant truth that few were willing to acknowledge. There were no escapes because the absolute majority of prisoners lost the mental, emotional and physical capacity necessary to plan, much less execute, an escape attempt within a few months of incarceration. It was not that the prison was architecturally perfect or that the Dementors were incomparable guards. It was that it systematically and deliberately destroyed the essential humanity of its occupants until they became literally incapable of conceiving any form of resistance or escape. In January 1996, the most devastating mass escape in Azkaban's history occurred. All imprisoned Death Eaters, including some of Voldemort's most fanatical and dangerous followers, simply disappeared from their cells in a single night. Bellatrix Lestrange, whose fanaticism for Voldemort was legendary. Lucius Malfoy, financier and political strategist. Dolohov, Rookwood, McNair, and other veterans of the First Wizarding War, a dozen minor criminals who quickly joined the ranks of the Death Eaters. The escape method revealed the extent of cooperation between Voldemort and the Dementors. The creatures not only facilitated the escape, they actively participated in it, sucking the souls of the few Aura guards who tried to resist. Sirius Black, for his part, spent 12 long years in Azkaban. The only reason he did not go mad like most long-term prisoners was his extremely rare ability to transform into a dog, a result of being an unregistered animagus. This alternative form profoundly altered his emotional and mental state, confusing and frustrating the Dementors. In canine form, Sirius did not feel the weight of human despair in the same way. Dogs live in the present, focused on immediate needs like food, shelter, and survival, and not on past guilt or existential fears. This difference was a kind of mental armor against the psychological exhaustion that destroyed other prisoners. Still, there were moments when he needed to reassume human form, either to feed properly or to maintain some minimal interaction. On these occasions, he clung to a single emotion that the Dementors had difficulty consuming completely, not happiness, but controlled and focused anger, in Sirius's case, an implacable hatred for Peter Pettigrew, the true traitor responsible for the death of James and Lily Potter. This anger, channeled with purpose, functioned as a barrier against the creature's emotional drainage. His escape began with news emblazoned in the Daily Prophet, the photograph of Pettigrew, disguised as the pet rat Scabbers, alongside young Ron Weasley. Sirius immediately recognized the face of the enemy everyone believed to be dead. This discovery ignited his determination. With the decision made, he began intentionally reducing his food intake, losing weight to the point of being able to escape through the cell bars when transformed into a dog. He waited patiently until a moment when the Dementors were less attentive, something facilitated by his constant state of animagus form and the fact that he did not exude the same kind of despair that betrayed other prisoners. On a cold night, he transformed into a dog, slipped through the bars, and crossed the fortress. No one noticed his absence until he was already in the icy waters around the island. He swam for kilometers, guided by instinct and superhuman endurance, until reaching the coast. From there, he began his silent journey in search of Hogwarts and Pettigrew. The escapes of Bellatrix and Sirius were deeply embarrassing for the Ministry of Magic and seriously questioned the supposed inviolability of Azkaban, but the coordinated mass escapes that followed represented a complete and catastrophic collapse of the security system that had been considered perfect for 3 centuries. The first mass escape happened when the Dementors began showing disturbing signs of intellectual and organizational evolution. During decades of constant and concentrated feeding on human suffering in Azkaban, they had gradually become more intelligent, more organized, and significantly more ambitious in their objectives and desires. More importantly, they began actively questioning why they should continue serving the Ministry of Magic when they could simply choose not to serve and pursue their own interests. When Lord Voldemort, through intermediaries specialized in negotiating with dark creatures, offered the Dementors something the Ministry had never considered providing: total and unrestricted freedom to feed without any limitation, regulation, or governmental supervision, they accepted the proposal immediately and enthusiastically. The negotiation was not politically complex or diplomatically elaborate. It was a simple and mutually beneficial commercial transaction. Voldemort offered large-scale war, widespread social chaos, and human suffering on a scale and intensity they had never experienced during their centuries of relative confinement in Azkaban. In exchange, they would give him immediate access to all the most dangerous, experienced, and fanatically loyal prisoners in the British magical world. During decades of apparently normal Azkaban operation, a single voice rose consistently and courageously against the use of the prison: Albus Dumbledore. even when his moral position made him politically unpopular among ministerial colleagues and cost him support from influential families. Dumbledore never hesitated to express his fundamental ethical opposition to what he clearly saw as institutionalized barbarism and systematic torture sanctioned by the government. In his own words, recorded in a historic Wizengamot session that became legendary, "A society that permits, encourages, and institutionalizes the systematic torture of prisoners, regardless of how serious their crimes may be, is not a civilized society by any significant moral definition. It is a society that consciously chose to embrace and normalize the same fundamental darkness it claims to combat and oppose." Dumbledore understood something profound that completely escaped many of his contemporaries. The use of Dementors as guards was not only cruel and inhumane for the directly affected prisoners, it was morally and spiritually corrosive for the entire magical society that permitted and supported such a system. When a society normalizes the systematic dehumanization of any group, even convicted criminals, it inevitably opens the door to the progressive dehumanization of other groups considered undesirable or problematic. His predictions about the eventual change of the Dementors' loyalty proved not only correct, but prophetically accurate in their details. Years before the formal alliance between Voldemort and the Dementors materialized, Dumbledore had repeatedly warned that creatures fundamentally fed by human suffering would inevitably turn against any society that tried to control them or limit their natural activities. When Kingsley Shacklebolt assumed office as Minister for Magic after Voldemort's final fall, one of his first and most controversial political decisions was to order the complete and revolutionary reform of Azkaban. The political and social resistance was intense and organized. Despite its obvious moral problems, Azkaban had functioned effectively as a criminal justice system for centuries. Shacklebolt responded to this resistance with a statement that became definitive and permanently transformed the public debate. Azkaban functioned only if we consider success the systematic, deliberate, and irreversible destruction of the fundamental humanity of thousands of people over centuries. If that is genuinely our standard of success as a civilized society, then we need to fundamentally and urgently re-examine our basic values as a moral community. The physical removal of the Dementors from Azkaban was an extraordinarily complex, dangerous, and technically challenging operation. The creatures were not simply dismissed administratively like normal employees. They had to be carefully and magically relocated through operations that lasted months, involving experts in dark creatures from throughout the magical world. Some were transported to alternative dimensions where they could not cause harm to any human population. Others were contained in magical reserves specially created in remote and completely isolated locations. The process was complicated by the fact that many Dementors had become significantly more powerful and intelligent during their centuries of concentrated feeding in Azkaban. The physical fortress underwent an extensive and unprecedented magical purification process. Experts in ancient curses, healers specialized in magical trauma, and priests from various spiritual traditions worked collaboratively for more than a year to cleanse the residual negative energy of accumulated centuries of concentrated suffering. New wings were completely rebuilt with specific focus on psychological rehabilitation, education, and preparation for social reintegration, instead of punishment and psychological breaking. Today, Azkaban functions as a prison facility, but a fundamentally different prison in philosophy, structure, and objectives. Guarded by experienced auras who work in regular rotation to avoid prolonged exposure to the still, somber environment, the prison now offers comprehensive psychological rehabilitation programs, extensive libraries, meaningful educational opportunities for prisoners, and even work programs that allow criminals to contribute positively to magical society while serving their sentences. But the dark and traumatic legacy of Azkaban cannot simply be erased through administrative reforms, however well-intentioned they may be. The original fortress still physically exists, still carries the architectural and energetic scars of centuries of systematized horror. Administrative staff and auras who work in the reformed prison regularly report that certain parts of the facility remain inexplicably cold in ways that cannot be explained or corrected, even with the most advanced magic available. Sometimes, distant echoes of ancient screams can still be heard in the deepest corridors during the quietest hours of the night. More significant and lastingly problematic is the reality that people who survived the old Azkaban, both prisoners and administrative staff, carry psychological traumas that never completely healed, even with decades of specialized magical treatment. There is an entire generation of witches and wizards who grew up knowing intimately that their society was not only capable of institutionalized barbarism, but had actively chosen that barbarism for political convenience and governmental economy. And so we come to the end of the darkest, most disturbing, and morally complex story in the magical world. Azkaban is not simply the story of a terrible prison, or even of a dark period in the history of magical justice. It is fundamentally the story of how collective fear, systematic prejudice, political convenience, and deliberate moral negligence can transform apparently normal and even well-intentioned people into active accomplices of atrocities they never imagined they would be capable of supporting. The true moral lesson of Azkaban is not in the specific horrors that happened within its stone walls over centuries, but in the terrifying ease with which an entire society, composed of individuals who considered themselves civilized and moral, deliberately chose to ignore, rationalize, and perpetuate these horrors for more than 300 years. Every time someone casually said, "The prisoners deserve what they are getting," every time politicians used the apparent success of Azkaban as a convenient electoral argument, every time ordinary citizens consciously chose not to think too deeply about what was really happening on that distant island. All of these were individual moral choices that collectively allowed the horror to continue generation after generation. If this story impacted you emotionally, if it changed your perspective on issues of justice and punishment, leave in the comments which part shocked you most or made you reflect. Thank you for watching until the end of this dark and necessary journey through the most disturbing story of the magical world. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the moral complexity of Azkaban, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content that explores the darkest secrets, the most difficult questions, and the most important lessons of the Harry Potter universe and beyond.